Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me okay? My name is Cindy Haken. I'm the Reader's Advisory Librarian at the Wallingford Public Library. Welcome on this gorgeous spring evening for a very special author visit to the Wallingford Public Library. There are about 30 people on Zoom so far. So between all of you in the room and those people on Zoom, I think we'll have a great crowd and a great evening. I want to start by sharing just a short anecdote. In 2011, when my older daughter was then 15, I had to do some quick math, we went together to the launch of a book tour for an author she was a huge fan of at the gorgeous Barnes & Noble down in Union Square in Manhattan. And we were sitting in the room like this, and the author walked in, and my daughter turned to me and she said, "This is for me, like going to a rock concert is for my friends." And I tell you that not to show you what a fabulous mother I must have been to have gotten that kind of comment, but because tonight, this for me is a little bit like that. I discovered Amy Bloom when her first short story collection, Come to Me, was published in 1993, and I read it and I was blown away by it. It was a finalist for the National Book Award, so I wasn't alone in being blown away by it, but it was one of those reading experiences where you say, okay, this is my kind of writer, my kind of author, I'm going to follow her. And I've read all of her books. She has two other short story collections, A Blind Man Can See How Much I Love You, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and Where the God of Love Hangs Out. Notice the use of the word love in the title of many of her books. She also wrote 4 novels, Love Invents Us, Away, Lucky Us, and White Houses. Several of those are in the back and for sale. In addition to being a brilliant writer, she is a psychotherapist and the Shapiro-Silverberg Professor of Creative Writing at Wesleyan University. We're here to talk about her newest book, which is not fiction. It's called In Love, and it came out in March. And I hope it is okay to say that I think this is the best thing she's ever written, which is a very high bar indeed. It is the account of the end of her husband's life. Anyone who lives in New Haven probably knew or knew of her husband, Brian, who was an architect who was diagnosed in his early 60s with Alzheimer's, and decided that he didn't want to go through the long, tortuous slide of that illness. And with Amy's help, they found a clinic called Dignitas in the suburbs of Switzerland and flew there together so that he might end his life with dignity. The book was an instant New York Times bestseller. It hit #2 on the nonfiction list. And if you pay attention to that list, you'll know what an achievement that is. It's been so far translated into 6 languages and has received absolutely glowing reviews. The Washington Post said Bloom's clear lyrical prose enriches the reader's life with urgency and gratitude. Publishers Weekly said this deeply moving memoir is a stunning portrayal of how love can reveal itself in life's most difficult moments. Dwight Gardner, writing in the New York Times, one of the most fun reviews I've read in a really long time, said that Bloom has one of those warm, wised up, tolerantly misanthropic New York voices. I aspire to emulate that, and an ability to deepen her tone at will, which is an extraordinary skill. I thought it was unbelievably moving and very, very beautiful. And I'm ecstatic to welcome Amy Bloom to the library to talk to you tonight.
Hi, oh, okay. Can you hear me? Yeah, this is. I have to say, when my dad was alive, he felt that one of his jobs was to go to my readings and sit in the back. And then when I would say, "Can everybody hear me?" my father would, of course, stand up and say, "Not at all. You're mumbling, honey." So I always just like to make sure that even in the back, everybody can hear me. I'm going to read from a couple of different parts of the book, and then I would talk a little bit about the different reasons that people write, including people who are not professional writers. There's a lovely new book out by a friend of mine, Anna Quinlan, called Write for Your Life. And it is, besides having all the best of her qualities, which I think is sort of warmth and empathy and attention, part of what she really wanted to say was, don't wait till you become a professional writer to think about writing about things that matter to you, which I agree with very much. I mean, I wrote this book mostly because Brian asked me to, and then he told me to, and so then I did. But he basically felt that the issues that he was grappling with, that we were grappling with, which is that what kind of rights do you have over your own life? What kind of rights do you have over your own end of life? What kind of choices do people get to make? Were things that people didn't talk about enough. And these had always been issues that he cared a great deal about. And so it mattered to him. It's actually the first page of the book. It says, "Please write about this," my husband said. And so I did have a lot of notes, as one does. Anybody in the room who's ever been a caregiver for somebody with an illness, you know that you have nothing but notes and calendars and Post-its and reminders and, oh, Wednesday at 3 o'clock, and don't forget the B12 supplements. And so eventually I was sort of able to put all the notes together. And then after he passed, to start working on the book that he wanted me to write. So this is that book. Sunday, January 26, 2020, Zurich, Switzerland. This trip to Zurich is a new, not quite normal version of something Brian and I love: traveling. Road trip, train ride, ferry ride, airplane, anywhere we like, all travel and most shopping. And this trip to Zurich has all the accoutrements of our other trips and is also nothing like anything we've ever done. As we usually do, we take a car service to the airport so we can be fancy and also avoid the park and schlep. And even before Brian had Alzheimer's, our combined lack of direction adds 20 minutes to all transportation transitions. We have a restaurant meal before our 6 p.m. departure. I buy a stick of lipstick and a small tube of hand cream. Brian buys some candy. Excuse me, we share gum, we share a bottle of water. On the plane, we enjoy the settling in, the attention of the flight attendants who already like us because Brian is mindful about his size, doesn't swing his arm into someone else's drink, and he expresses appreciation to every single Swiss Air representative. We seem like people who will not be screaming for more booze or more peanuts at midnight. There is no one who loves business class more than people who always fly coach. We are smiling from the moment we board. I arrange our business class pods. We are gushingly polite to the attendants. It's obvious that we like each other and are happy to be traveling together. And as soon as we get our beverages in glasses, we toast my sister and brother-in-law who are paying for our business class trip to Zurich. Dignitas's office is in Zurich, and that's where we're headed. Dignitas is a Swiss nonprofit organization offering accompanied suicide. For the last 22 years, Dignitas has been the only place to go if you are an American citizen who wants to die, and if you are not certifiably terminally ill with no more than 6 months to live. This is the current standard in the United States, even in the right to die states, plus the District of Columbia, about which many older or chronically ill Americans harbor end-of-life fantasies, and which I researched at Brian's direction until we discovered that the only place in the world for painless, peaceful, and legal suicide is Dignitas in the suburbs of Zurich. My sister had cried with me since the second appointment with the neurologist, when it took the doctor less than an hour to give Brian a mental status exam and inform us that Brian almost certainly had Alzheimer's and had probably had it for several years, judging by his high IQ, his struggles with balance and proprioception, and his poor performance on the exam. It took Brian less than a week to decide that the long goodbye of Alzheimer's was not for him, and less than a week for me to find Dignitas at the end of several long Google paths. From summer to winter, my sister Ellen, who loves me and loved Brian, did her best not to make suggestions, not to offer if-onlys, Not to say that maybe Brian's Alzheimer's wouldn't be too bad or would progress very slowly. Not to cry when I wasn't crying, and not to pour out her own grief at the loss of one of her favorite people and our compatible foursome. When they had met for the first time 14 years ago, Brian went into my sister's kitchen with his winning ways and said, "I really love your sister." My sister didn't turn around. She said, "Hurt her and I will kill you." Ellen called me early one morning in December when we were pretty sure that we cleared the hurdles for Dignitas and said to me, "Just tell me what you need." I said reluctantly, $20,000, and my big sister said, "Here's a check for 30." We ended up spending every penny of it between a couple of last big fishing trips for Brian and his not working and my not working, our eating out all the time, sometimes lunch and dinner at the nicest restaurants in New Haven. We spent it on what was to be our last joint birthday celebration and on 4 nights in a 5-star hotel in Zurich and the car services and the tours of Zurich and my friend flying to and from Zurich to keep me company on the flight home, on whatever makes bad months bearable, plus the cost of Dignitas itself, which was around $10,000 all in. In our Swiss Air pods, Brian and I toast each other and we say, "Here's to you," a little hesitantly, instead of what we usually say, "Cent'anni," may we have 100 years, a very Italian toast. There is no Cent'anni for us. We won't make it to our 13th wedding anniversary. We lean closer to each other and then we pull back, each of us fussing with our shoes and carry-ons, each of us opening our little gift bags from the airline and pulling out the socks, yes, and the eye masks, no, and the tiny toothpaste and tiny toothbrushes, which we persist in believing will delight the grandchildren, which they never do. It is all nearly normal, like so much that we've done these last few years, like the flight itself and everything that precedes it. The trip to the airport, the TSA, our petty but deep pleasure in having TSA pre-check, noting the much longer shoes off lines to the left of us, the pretty good meal at JFK. It all seems normal, except that I still remember how different it was to be together, to be with Brian 3 years ago, when I didn't hold my breath from the time he went off to the newsstand until he came back. From the outside, or some kind of inside, an inside where I too have no memory of how we used to live our actual life, it is nearly normal. For the trip to JFK, we didn't use Arnold, the guy who always drives our car at the airport and returns it to our driveway. Arnold has been driving us and our kids and grandkids for 6 years, and he has shared with us all about his love of motorcycles, his sobriety, his wife's health issues, to balance, I think, all the information he has gathered about us, whether he wanted it or not. I could not bear to lie to Arnold about where we are going, and I cannot bear to tell him the truth, and I could not come up with a half-truth, the favorite technique of serious liars, about why we're going to Zurich in late January, for the skiing, for the ice fishing, for the Chagall windows in the Frauenminster Church. I was afraid that Arnold would watch us sympathetically in the rearview mirror, and I could not bear it for Brian's pride and my general soft-boiledness, and just as I could not bear any harshness at all, I didn't think I could take kindness either. I wanted absolutely nothing, a blanket of indifference, and that was exactly what we got from the driver of the local limo service. He spoke once in a 2.5-hour drive. Perfect. At JFK, we stood mid-Terminal 4 and agreed on the restaurant nicer than Shake Shack, which I love and Brian does not, but not as nice as the Palm Steakhouse, which seems insanely high-priced. But as I am writing this, I remember that we did go to the Palm after all, because obviously, and Brian ordered everything he wanted, and it seemed to me everything that anyone can imagine ordering at the Palm Steakhouse, except vodka on the rocks, which he had been mentioning wanting from time to time for the last year or so. At the Palm, Brian ordered onion rings and a rare ribeye with a side of hash browns and a Caesar salad and garlic toast, and he would have ordered a shrimp cocktail as well, except that I whispered, like the circa 1953 staged Jewish wife I seem to have become, missing only my home permanent and a rickrack trimmed apron, "Really? Shrimp in a steak place in an airport? Is that wise?" Brian shrugged to say, "I'm not that excited about airport shrimp anyway. And also, what's the worst that could happen? I could have a bite and it's meh, and then I wouldn't eat it. It's a waste of money. So what? Or I could die from bad shrimp, and wouldn't that save us all a lot of trouble? Or I could get food poisoning and have to miss the flight." And at this, he folded the menu and looked at the way looked at me the way he often did now, with resigned understanding, fatigue, and a little worn humor. I teared up all through dinner, with Brian occasionally patting my hand. I kept crying because I loved him and his appetites and all the sensuality and good humor and heat-seeking that went with them. This is a little bit about the beginning of his symptoms of Alzheimer's. For a little while in 2007, Brian and I were bi-coastal. I worked in LA on a short-lived TV show, and he flew in from Hartford right after work every 2 weeks, took a quick nap in my office on Friday night, and woke up to have dinner with me and whoever was still around the set. He read multiple drafts of each week's show and watched the scenes when he could. He'd find a corner to sit in and take note of everything: costume, makeup, rehearsal, petty disagreements. He loved each surreal and complex part of shooting a show. One weekend, Brian woke up early and came back with an inflatable raft. He asked me to make sandwiches and drove us to the set in Burbank. He chatted up the security guard who waved us in. We spent most of the day in and around a real pool, ate a real lunch, and lounged in the sun in our beautiful fake world. And when we left, Brian handed the security guard the bottle of white wine he kept chilling for him in the pool. 2 years ago, I gave Brian a new script of mine to read, and my husband, my cheerleader, TV lover, inveterate script reader, the man who half hoped we'd wind up in Silver Lake, California, and not Stony Creek, Connecticut, didn't read it. In the years we were together, Brian read everything I'd ever written, within days of my finishing. After a week, I asked about the TV script, and Brian said he hadn't gotten around to it. He sounded a little puzzled. Weeks went by, and I steeled myself and asked him about it again, and he said, with no chagrin and not much interest, that the format was too hard to follow. He left it lying on the bedroom floor until I took it back to my office. Back to the JFK Palm Steakhouse, we ate and tipped well, and then found our way to the Swiss Air Lounge, which had been moved temporarily to the very distant lounge of Emirates Airline, where the female staff at the front desk combined brisk efficiency with an unmistakable nod to deference, an actual repeated head duck in their dealings with Brian. I got a bland sideways smile. I handled the tickets and I handled the passports, and still the longer we stood there, the more, what else can I do for you, Mr. Amici, there was. Nothing comparable was coming my way. Brian did not mind. Even I didn't mind. Patriarchy and my handsome husband, what are you gonna do? The lounge was clean and there was a lot of fruit and all sorts of buffet dishes, proper Middle Eastern, Italianish, Frenchish, and a bustling bar. And Brian snagged a big ball of falafel as we got settled. It wasn't stealing, of course, but I didn't think it was polite to reach out with your great big fingers into a pile when there were silver tongs and tiny forks and small plates and matching cocktail napkins. And Brian didn't care if it was rude or not, and that not caring was not a function of Alzheimer's. He had never cared. He scouted the lounge for a satisfactory pair of armchairs and dove into the New York and London Timeses. I don't know what reading the newspaper means to him anymore. Politics, a bit of sports news, a football player at Yale in his day. He refuses to watch college football now, upset at the lack of care for the players, but he still keeps track of which teams are doing what. There's some tidbits about real estate or architecture or design that used to catch his eye from his 40 years as an architect, and he never comments anymore. He used to read me several paragraphs at a clip about things that struck him, and even more, he loved for me to read articles to him while he drove. I never read aloud to him enough to suit him, but I once did almost the entire Sunday Review while we pursued an unlikely 5-star barbecue place on the other side of Connecticut. And when I faltered on the last op-ed piece, he said, "Finish strong, darling." Brian folded up the newspapers to bring on the plane, and then he thought better of it. There was a whole style of planning, of near hoarding of favorite things, of anticipating his own needs, which had been his way since we met. He never got into his car from April to November without making sure he had at least one of his lesser fishing rods and some flies in the trunk. He never left a restaurant without fistfuls of mints to put in his nightstand, candy jar, and glove compartment. On this trip, he is done with that. I give him a wad of Swiss francs. He knows where his medications are, and if he doesn't have it now, he doesn't need it. And if I am not carrying it for him, it's not important. We land in Zurich, and the hotel's car service takes us to the pretty hotel in the cobblestoned Old Town section. It's warmer than we expected, and it's drizzling. Every restaurant we pass is filled with couples, most of whom are apparently pairs of straight white men in business-ish clothes. Sometimes they are foursomes. Occasionally there is a businessman in his late 60s and a hot young thing in a silk mini dress and strappy sandals, and all I think is, oh my God, the Cobblestones. Between Brian's trouble with proprioception this year, gashing his hand, slipping off the front porch, tumbling backward off a picnic brunch, I have a new for Zurich terror, which is that he will slip and fall on the wet cobblestones of Old Town, and we will not be able to get ourselves to Dignitas. And so cobblestones and conversations about cobblestones loom very large on this trip. It seems to me that I am doing the right thing in supporting Brian in his decision, but it would be better and easier if he could make all the arrangements himself and I could just be a dutiful duckling following in his wake. Of course, if he could make all the arrangements himself, he wouldn't have Alzheimer's. And if he had wanted to make all the arrangements himself on his own, he wouldn't have been Brian. I walk this loop in my mind as I wake up and unpack. I think of Suzy Chang, my eminently sensible tarot card reader, and if you think that it is absurd to find comfort in tarot, I have no argument for you. She uses the crow deck to take a look at what might happen or what I might wish to mitigate. My two daughters appear repeatedly as two crows or two lions or two shields in front of me. And again, if you think that this is the height of idiocy, I don't disagree. Turning over the chariot card in a last reading before Brian and I go to the airport, Suzy and I see a small crab in the corner of the card. This is your card, Suzy Chang says. You have to drive this chariot, and you have to drive it with a hard shell because otherwise it will crush you beneath the wheel. She says you cannot let go until it is all over. And I make an I know noise, and she taps the card and she says, if you let go of the reins, this will crush you. And I burst into tears. And most of the time, I do feel like the little crab, armored and fragile. Thank you. So, one of the things that people ask about is whether or not writing this book was cathartic for me. And I think it was not particularly cathartic for me because I am a writer, because this is sort of my job. And my dad, to whom I referred earlier, was also a writer. And he was a great role model because he was a freelance writer. He had been a journalist, and as he said, had not had a proper job since 1937, which he was very pleased about. And I understood that writing was a job. And as he, like being a plumber, that's how you pay your rent. It's how you pay your bills. So writing this for me was really for Brian, and also because it was what I knew how to do with the feelings that I had. But what I've really come to feel as people have been writing to me since the book has come out is how valuable it is for such a wide range of people. It has nothing to do with being professional. It doesn't even have to do necessarily with being widely read. It just has to do with a way of thinking about your own life and your own story and the things that matter to you and the things that you regret and the things that you wish for and the plans that you have and the plans that you had. And it seems to me that it's a really wonderful opportunity to communicate with the people in your life. And so often people I know will feel that they have not much to say. But it turns out, as you've probably discovered, that if you are willing to listen, people are fascinating. I mean, they're annoying, but they're often very interesting as well. And I remember doing a couple of workshops for adults who were not professional writers. And in one, I had a mixture of grown people, grown people like us, and very young people, people who were, I would say, between like 20 and 23. And I asked them to write portraits of each other just as kind of a warm-up exercise, just so people could practice writing and observing and thinking about what they had observed and how you wanted to express that and what mattered and what didn't matter and how you wanted to hold all of that on a page. And one of the things that I observed is that the grown-ups, us, when they were looking at the kids and describing them, would often say things like, oh, they're so beautiful, and their skin. And the children, the young people, when they were writing about the grown-ups, would say things like, she seems like a very nice person. And there would be no physical observations at all. And I think one of the things that that really made me aware of was how important it was to be able to look at your own life and the lives of the people around you and be able to write about it, if not fearlessly, at least with less fear. There's a gorgeous book by Paula Fox called Desperate Characters, which is her own memoir of her truly ghastly childhood. And at one point, she's talking about sort of growing up and having survived the trauma of her childhood. And she said, I didn't have the nerve to do what came next, so I had to do it without the nerve. Is really one of my favorite lines for life. And I feel like that's sort of what it was like for me writing this book. I mean, I didn't, first of all, I didn't read memoirs. I had no wish to write a memoir. I had not been secretly contemplating how delightful it would be to reveal my inner life to a bunch of people I didn't know and then get reviewed for it. I mean, all of which sounds great even now. And, but I did feel like I don't have the nerve to do this, so I will simply have to do it without the nerve. I will just have to tell the truth. And it turns out, I think, for lots of people, the things that we go through, as all you guys know, right? Old age is not for sissies. That as you have to walk down these halls and across these roads and across these bridges and see the doors that have closed, right? It is true that often a door closes and another one opens, but if you've lived long enough, you know that it's also true that sometimes a door just closes. No window. That it's worth thinking about and remembering and writing about. And I just can't say enough about the way in which I think other people in your life can find that of value. When I wrote my first set of notes for this, it was really quite soon after Brian died, you may also recall. So Brian dies in January of 2020. By the time I am flying back from Zurich, airports are already closing. By the time I get home, having anticipated what one of my daughters calls a long Chekhovian widowhood, in which apparently I was going to be dressed largely in lavender gauze and staring out the window for weeks, preferably months, which is sort of what I thought too. I said to my therapist, I said, I'm going to get home from Zurich, I'm going to climb into bed, and I'm not going to get out for 2 weeks. And he said, have you ever done that? I was like, no, but I can try. I'm going to do nothing. I'm going to lie in bed. He said, well, let me know. So that didn't work out. And it didn't work out in part because I was lucky enough that as the pandemic was raining down upon us, my younger daughter in Brooklyn called me really a couple of weeks after I had gotten home and said, Mama, there is no babysitter. There is no daycare. The preschool has closed and we both have to work full-time from home. And I said, get in the car. And it was a tremendous gift to me, and not one that I would have known I needed or wanted. But that possibility and that reality of being surrounded by life and being required to live was such an unexpected gift. And so in the mornings, I would take care of Zora, who was then not quite 3. And we learned a lot of Spanish pre-K songs. She had been in a daycare center that was run by 2 lovely Dominican ladies. And so we learned a lot of Spanish songs. And I think we both had developed a little bit of a Dominican accent by the end. And then I would hand her off to her mother's at lunchtime, at the end of lunchtime, and then I would run over to my office and I would write for about 4 or 5 hours. And everybody has to grieve in their own way. It turns out that for me, it was not a problem to bring my grief forward. I didn't feel like I ever had to put it down or abandon it or turn away from it. Turns out, you can carry it with you like your skin. And, but the opportunity to think about and write about this. And then I started to just share it with my girls, who had, of course, gone through this experience very much with me and for me, and were really formidable in their determination to take care of me. And I think for them also, it was an opportunity then to talk about what it had been like, even in the recent past. And also it gave all of my kids a chance to sort of begin to talk about Brian and what they had missed and what they had seen but had not wanted to talk about. And I think that if you can look at your life and write about it, and if you can look at some details that are sometimes painful, it is worth keeping track of them. It is worth not just putting on a strong face for the people around you, but it is worth telling people what something has been like for you, even if it was 40 years ago. It has meaning for you. The past, as we all know, as Faulkner famously said, I don't know why people say the past is dead. Hell, it ain't even past. And that is how I have come to feel about it as well. You bring everything with you. And writing is, as it turns out, for a lot of people, a way of making sense of your own life, as well as making sense of the life that you would like to have. So with that, I am very happy to open this up to questions, and I will tell you whatever I know about whatever it is that you want to ask. Whether it's in the book, whether it's reading or writing. I used to play a lot of tennis. I can do that. Yes, sir.
Can I ask about Brian's decision?
Mhm.
How do you have the experience of what it was like with his family, or what was behind his decision to make?
I think there were really two things behind it. One is that as Brian would have said, one of his guiding principles in life was that if you don't want to have a fight, but if you're going to have a fight, throw the first punch. Which I think is very much how he felt about Alzheimer's. And he had always been very keen on sort of the right to choose, the right to live, the right to die, that people should be allowed to make their own decisions about it. There have been a couple of issues in his family, including a close friend who had become a quadriplegic as a result of an accident at the age of 22, and who was increasingly ill and in decline. And that family had decided to honor that young man's wishes to end his life. And that had been 25 years ago. Also, in our extended family, the woman who was like an aunt to him, my mother-in-law's best friend, had really a fairly rapid onset of Alzheimer's. And we had seen close up, the shift from her discomfort and her unease and her confusion, and then her inability to navigate her car down roads. They had been best friends for 50 years. These were, let's go to the club at Saturday at 4:30 and have a drink kind of friends. Let's go to the 1 o'clock movie on Sunday. And we had been close up involved with her decline, and then her eventually being in assisted living, which she could not tolerate because she simply didn't have the function for it. And then in a memory care unit, and the agony that she, my mother-in-law's friend, experienced, and also the agony that my mother-in-law and all of us in the family experienced. So I think when he said to me, I am not here for the long goodbye, he knew what he was talking about. He had seen it close up, especially with his aunt. And he just knew that that was not for him. Yeah.
I was really struck by how many things there was. And also the brain moving between fancy food and ordinary food and all.
but your voice, I was struck by that. The way that there's kind of a that I would call frank and ordinary in a way, very accessible. As you collect in the first story, precious little details of forks that could be used back down to work into Absolutely. Well, I don't know if I can do the question justice entirely. She says a lot of nice things about me. And then I think part of what you were asking about a little bit was sort of, how did I find that voice? A sort of frank and accessible voice that's sort of attentive to detail, but maybe not so fancy. I think a lot of that, I mean, you want a book to seem effortless. You want it to seem like it just fell out, and that's the goal. It should not, for me, it should not show effort. It should not show rewriting. I am, in fact, most of the time, not with this book, a terribly slow writer and a painstaking writer. I'm perfectly happy to spend 2 days on a paragraph, as my publisher can tell you. I had a book come out one time, and Random House had an advertisement in the New York Times, and the advertisement actually said, "At long last." And I was like, rude. I'm doing my best here. This book came out in a white hot hurry. This book, I had notes for it. Brian died at the end of January. I turned this book in the following November, which for me was just, that will never happen again. But I think the voice is just me. I'm a fairly straightforward person. I go through this stage of my life. This is with my mother and my father on my shoulder, with my mother saying, "Darling, everybody doesn't have to know what you think." And my father saying, "If you care what strangers think of you, shame on you." So I think that's in the book. I think there are certainly moments where I chose to be as tactful as I could. And there were also moments where I let myself be as angry or as sad or both as I was. But what I did not want to do was write a varnished, intentionally softened, determinedly uplifting version of this experience. There were moments of great joy, and there were moments of excruciating pain. And it seemed to me that if I was going to write about it, my job was to tell it as clearly as I could. There's a lot of Brian in the book, and there's a lot of Brian's opinions and approaches to things in the book. And somebody said, "Oh, what I like about the book is that you both have faults." And I thought, oh my God, you have no idea. But I feel like the faults, like the food, are part of what made us who we are, And I will say that my general advice, and occasionally people say to me, "Oh, I'm thinking of getting married again. I'm 50 or I'm 60 or I'm 70. And all I say is, you better like the faults, because those are not going away. And you better prefer them to other kinds of faults." And I did. Brian was a fearless, slightly reckless, slightly aggressive guy. And I preferred all of that to the kind of person to whom you have to say, "It's okay, it's okay, come on, we can cross the street, it's okay, it's okay." He was not like that. Brian was the kind of guy where you're driving with him in the passenger seat, you're hanging on to the "oh shit" bar. And I preferred that.
A question on Zoom from Amy: did Brian have family members, and if so, how did they feel about his decision?
Yes, Brian was the oldest son of a large Italian family, which you would recognize immediately when you met him. He carried himself like the oldest son of a large Italian family. The star of the story really is my mother-in-law, his mother, who is still with us, who's 88, who is very religious, Catholic, and I told her one morning about Brian's decision. She'd come up to visit, and she knew about the diagnosis, and she'd come to visit. And we're both early risers, and I also wanted to have a conversation with her that Brian didn't have to be present for, because if it went badly, I didn't want him to have to deal with it. And I told Yvonne what Brian's decision was, and that I was supporting him in that, and how he was going to be ending his life. And she wept, and I thought, I cannot bear to tell this woman this terrible news. And she said, I am so relieved. She said, I prayed about it all night, but having gone through this with my best friend, she said, I did not want this for my boy. And thank you. So that was the only part of the family response that I cared about. You know, we still speak every 2 weeks, and that's a couple of years ago. Other members of his family, everybody in the end was supportive, as were his friends. But I think everybody has their own journey with this. My decision for myself was that I was going to be as forgiving as I knew how to be. For Brian, occasionally he would get an email from some friend from high school, for example, who would say things like, I Googled Alzheimer's, and I don't think you need to end your life. You should have plenty of good years ahead of you. And my uncle, who has Alzheimer's, was at a family party last year, and he seemed to be having a great time. So I was sitting there open-mouthed, and it was really interesting to me, because there's a certain kind of, certain kinds of nuances were a little harder for Brian to express as the Alzheimer's got worse, but not his sort of general understanding of people's positions. And I remember him looking at the email and going, this is my life. This is my business. And I said, mm-hmm. And he said, I don't know who the son of a bitch thinks he is. And I'm like, oh, well, you went to high school with me. He said, I know who he is. He says, I just don't know who he thinks he is. But he wrote back a very nice email that said, dear so-and-so, I appreciate your concern, and you are entitled to your own opinion. We are available for your support and your love. I was like, well, you nailed that one.
My question is, what year did Brian start to show serious side, and compared to then when Brian decided that you go to Switzerland?
I would say that, sorry, the question was, when did Brian first start showing symptoms of Alzheimer's? I would say probably about 3 years before we went to the neurologist. And for me, as for anybody else who's involved with somebody with a dementing disease, it's a diagnosis that's most useful in hindsight, right? You get the diagnosis and you go, oh, I think that was that. I think that was that. And so there were, his last job, he got like that. He got hired as a university architect. They loved him in the interview, because what was not to love? And within a couple of months of his having that job, he would come home and say, I'm just not sure what's going on. And I said, well, what's happening? And he said, well, the secretary is very short with me, which is really not usually the way that it was for Brian. People were happy to help, and he was appreciative often. And what it turned out, as far as I could understand from him, was that he couldn't operate the printer. He just couldn't do the printer. He could do the design work, which was not very complicated, and he was a very good architect, but he could not remember from one week to the next how to work the printer. And that, for me, was a significant signal. And there were other things like that, and we could see them building up. And we probably, I'd like to think we would have gotten to the neurologist anyway, but in fact, he had a hip replacement done, and he was aware that his short-term memory was just so weak that he would be sort of surprised when the physical therapist came to the house. Or I would have said to him, I'm going to go to the grocery store when the physical therapist comes, and I'll be back before they leave. And then he'd be like, where's Amy? And so he said, well, let's talk to the surgeon about it. We talked to the surgeon. The surgeon was like, this does happen sometimes. You just really get walloped with anesthesia. It takes a few weeks to come back, maybe as long as a month. And then after another 2 weeks, Brian said, I think we should go find out what's going on with my memory. And that is how we went. And I will say that there's a lot that you don't get if you have a dementing disease from talking to a neurologist. But one of the things that you can get is a little more time to do some planning and some decision making. Brian and I had close friends, and another friend who had played football. And by the time he had gone to a neurologist, after all the should we, shouldn't we, isn't this really just normal aging, after all of that, it was really too late for him to make a decision, not too late for them to plan, but too late for him to be active in the decision making about his life. And that, to me, is one of the really important reasons to go as early as, even earlier than you think is absolutely necessary, because you want the opportunity to make a decision, and you cannot make a decision about how you want to end your life unless you can function cognitively. And that requires, as Brian said, with Alzheimer's, if you don't leave a little earlier than you want to, you don't get to leave at all.
There's a wonderful comment and a question in the chat here on Zoom. I'm going to read it a little bit out of order. Thank you for sharing your story. I didn't want to write the book, but I very much did.
Fair.
You very much allowed us all to meet him and know him and care for you both. I thought the book was very brave. Did you have any concerns about legal implications in publishing the story? I believe you mentioned the Dignitas people suggested you distance yourself from the actual event.
Well, yes, and I appreciate the comment. I had some concerns about it. My big sister, who also figures in the novel, is a lawyer, and she read it. And the lawyers for Random House read it. And we hadn't done anything illegal. I mean, you are allowed to go to Switzerland. And, you know, whether you are a fan of big government or small government, you are still allowed to go to Switzerland. And what the Swiss were actually saying to me was not that I needed to distance myself from the fact of his death, only that they would, in fact, the Swiss police would come because there was a body and there had been a death. And they, I think, wished in their kindness and in their tact, which is considerable, to spare me that experience of like the Zurich police arriving at the door while I was still sitting there. But it was not, there are some countries in which, in England, for example, people get concerned that they go to Dignitas, and it's not really true anymore, but it used to be that sometimes you would come back from Dignitas having brought your mother, your father, your grandparent, your spouse, and there somebody in the neighborhood would have said, you know, I think they went and Charles ended his life over there. And sometimes there would be policemen on the door as people returned home from the airport. I don't think that happens as much anymore. It's an interesting sort of thing. There is, in Europe, I think more countries are more comfortable with the fact that Switzerland offers this option, because more countries in Europe have changed their laws to be somewhat more accommodating to people choosing if they wish to end their lives in a way that has just nothing to do with how we do it in the United States. Yes, sir.
You mentioned how asked you to write the book and then told you that book. Did he say anything about what he wanted in the book, and was his desire for you to write the book, was it just to tell the personal story, or was part of it a motivation to try to change the laws?
Well, I think that he felt I know that he felt very strongly that the laws in America, in what are described as the right to die states, were not really delivering what people thought they were. in terms of choices that people could make. And he felt that people should talk more about it. He felt that it was such a taboo subject. He and his family had also been involved in a project on grief and resiliency because he had lost his youngest brother, Paul, when he was 20 in a car accident on Christmas Eve. And the family had gotten very involved in kind of grief and grief counseling, and also in a filmmaking project about resilience. So this had always been on his mind. And I think he wanted me to tell the personal story. As one of his best friends said to me, "You made him look good. He would have liked it." And I hope so. But also that he thought people should talk about it more, that people, our age should begin to have conversations about, what do you think about this? How do you see this? And lots of times one cannot plan at all. But I remember my own experience of chasing my own parents around a fairly small house, and they were not young people, and they were moving very quickly. And I'm sort of waving a living will at them, going, "You have got to think about this." And, I'd walk into the kitchen, my father would be having a cup of coffee. He'll be like, I'm just going to finish the Times here. And I'd try to find my mother in the bedroom. She had gone out to the backyard. She was hanging laundry. I'm like, could we just have a conversation? And basically they were like, no, that won't be possible. And finally I sort of nailed them at dinner time with the lure of Chinese food. But it was an effort. And I think Brian's feeling was that people should talk about this. And he did very much have strong feelings about the law, but I think he saw this not so much as a book to advocate, as a book to maybe start conversations. Yes. Hi. The question was there any conversation about what he felt came afterwards? What people talk about is the afterlife. So when we were in Zurich, and you have these interviews with the doctors who are, again, endlessly checking to make sure that there's cognitive judgment, to make sure that there's discernment, and also to make sure that you have not changed your mind. And they say 40 times, "Are you sure? Are you comfortable with this decision? Would you like to take a little more time? Please don't hesitate to change your mind." And they say that really up until the last 40 minutes of your life. And at one point, the very nice Swiss doctor who was doing the interview said to him, "Well, Mr. Amici, I've read your essay, and we've had this conversation. It doesn't sound like you believe in a lot." And Brian said, "Oh, on the contrary, I believe in many, many things. It's just that the afterlife isn't one of them." And I would say that was his feeling about it. I'll also tell you my favorite story about my tarot card reader, Suzy Chang, because it's such an odd thing for me to have this person in my life, because I am a hardcore rationalist. But after Brian had died, it was a very hard period. And I talked to Suzy, and I said, do you have a feeling about how he's doing? And she said something, benign. And then he was a great fly fisherman. And I said, "Is he like a salmon or something now?" And she said in the flattest, most sensible voice, "That's not a thing."
Did she do any cards for him?
Pardon me?
Did she do any cards for him? For you?
For me, yes.
Did she do cards for you
And for him.
as to where
Yeah.
he was?
Yeah.
Okay.
Successfully crossing a bridge.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Wait a minute.
You won't get any argument from me. I think people should believe in anything that they find helpful that doesn't hurt anybody else. Period. So, anything else I can?
Question about whether or not you were thinking about or currently working on another book.
She must have been sent by Random House. Yes, I am. I actually taught my last class a couple of weeks ago. I'm sort of finishing up book events for this book here and in Europe, and sort of given myself till June 1st to start working on a novel, which is a collection of linked short stories about one family and a couple from their wedding day to their death 50 years later. It's called Our Life. I think it will be slow because I'm slow, but I'm actually looking forward to writing about people who are not me and not Brian. So I thank you all for coming this evening very much, and I'll sign books in the back if anybody wants.